our Colloquium series, to our fourth talk in the School of Teacher Education Colloquium series. Today's presenter is Dr. Blake Tenore. He's teaching faculty 2 and coordinator of English education. The title of his talk is Critical Autoethnography for Scholarship, Pedagogy, and Personal Growth in Teacher Education. Since 2016, Dr. Blake Tenore has led the secondary English education program in the College of Education. He is inescapably called to and fascinated by the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves that make ourselves. I'm going to turn it to you, Dr. Blake Tenore.
Thank you, Amal. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. And thank you to the Colloquium Committee for inviting me to share some of my work that centers around the idea of autoethnography. Autoethnography is a method that I've been playing with for the past few years, both in scholarship and in my teacher education pedagogies. And what I'll talk about today, I've kind of structured my talk as a sort of a tour through a few different iterations of how I've thought about this work and how I've incorporated it into my practice. You'll notice that I've listed a co-presenter, Dr. Julie Justice. She's not here, but I did want to acknowledge her because most of the work that I'll talk about today has been deeply and intimately collaborative. And I certainly wanted to acknowledge that this is a shared effort. Like Amal said, I'm a specialized teaching faculty. So in case any of our audience isn't exactly sure what that means, it means that the majority of the expectation of my job is to teach and teacher education courses. I do find some time once in a while to dabble in some scholarly activity, which I'll talk a little bit about today as well. Throughout the presentation, there are solid slides that sort of divide the sections, and I'll stop at those slides in case there are questions. Throughout, though, please use the chat. Holler, please don't be shy about interrupting. I'd kind of prefer to respond directly to your questions and inquiries than just to rattle on at you from here. So I will go ahead and begin. I think we get all the right buttons here. There we go. So by way of sort of an outline of the talk, I've laid it out chronologically along my experiences. I'll start just a little bit with a discussion or explanation of my own scholarly interest in narrative ways of knowing. And that leads into the next sort of scholarship portion of my talk. Julie and I co-edited a collection of what at the time we called scholarly narratives. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. And then from there, we moved into collaborative autoethnography. And I'll, of course, define all these terms as we go. And that got into some of the more specific study of ourselves as an outcome of the production of the book. And then I'll talk in sections about the ways that I've used autoethnography in pre-service teacher education, as well as in-service teacher professional development. So sort of wanted to frame the whole presentation around this idea that that answers the question, why autoethnography? And Mark Davies is one of the contributors to the edited volume that Julie and I co-edited. And he said, to be authentic to the critical process, we have to turn the process back on ourselves. We have to be real. If I'm going to publicly name systems as problematic, I better be able to name my own contributions to the problem. So that gets at, for me, how I think about the critical and critical autoethnography. I don't know if, I didn't notice if Stacy popped in or not, but I feel like in every meeting that we have throughout this semester in our ongoing conversations about equity and justice, and I agree with her and thank her for pointing it out, that if we're going to make changes, we need to do some sincere examinations of ourselves. So that's one of the ways that I think about autoethnography, as providing a set of tools to deeply examine both who we are and how we got that way, but perhaps most importantly, why those things continue to matter and how we do our work, and how we see ourselves. So this whole story begins for me with other people's stories. I started my career as a high school English teacher, and have continued to do my work centered around English education and literacy studies, and always have been interested in the ways that we tell stories. So a lot of the heart of this is in narrative and autobiography. And the work of psychologist Jerome Bruner, who has done work around the ideas of narrative ways of knowing, have really helped frame my thinking, particularly around the ideas that autobiographical telling of stories is not capital T truth. It's a version that we select and craft and present to ourselves and the world. So that gets at kind of the teaser from the flyer about the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves that make ourselves. And even the stories we tell ourselves are not capital T truth. So just a couple of excerpts from the way that Bruner thinks about autobiographical telling. One, that they're a cognitive achievement. Are the stories that we tell about ourselves don't slip unfiltered out of our consciousness into the world. They're crafted and they're wrought with decision making and selectivity. They are a cognitive achievement. He talks about them as being privileged but troubled. So privileged because if I'm telling an autobiographical story, I'm the only one who has access to all of the information. That's my privileged position. But troubled because I'm also sort of inherently unreliable because of the decisions that I make as I craft the story that comes out to the world. He talks about autobiographical accounts as unstable, and that they're susceptible to cultural, interpersonal, and linguistic influences. So again, nothing that comes out of me autobiographically and narratively is just mine. It has been filtered and mingled with all of the cultural and linguistic influences that I might draw upon to change or augment or shape the story that I want my audience to hear. And then thinking about not only in autobiographical telling the landscape of action, the plot, the events, but recognizing that there is a landscape of consciousness that makes up the inner world of the teller as well. So all of these things have been kind of incorporated into my work, especially early on, and my thinking about what it means to know and what it means to story our experiences. And autoethnography came into my life and sort of offered some tools for really digging into the cracks among the pieces. The constructed nature of our stories means there's something really interesting going on, like I said, in the spaces and cracks between what's told. So I liken it to the gutters in a comic strip. For any of you who are in the practice of reading comics or multimodal analysis, we say that we don't just skip over the gutters. We have to infer and interpret and understand what happens between the images and the panels. And that's a little bit of how I think about what autoethnography is for, is getting into the gutters of our storytelling. So this interest in narrative shared by my colleague, Dr. Justice. And by the way, that's a lot to live up to when you choose a colleague named Dr. Justice. You better bring some game. So this started really authentically for us, honestly, at conferences and sharing stories, and usually around meals and often late into the night, sharing stories of practice and recognizing that how powerful and useful these stories were for us. And we decided to, Julie always described it as, when people ask how we got contributions for the book, Julie always said, we invited our friends and heroes. There was a lot of kind of cold calling. And what's on the screen here, so the problem that we settled on, that we wanted to address as people who identified as critical literacy educators, was that, of course, there's a tremendous amount of scholarship and a long history of studying the practices of preparing teachers to be critical educators, to be culturally relevant educators, to be successful educators of quote unquote other people's children. What there's not very much of is examinations of the people doing that work and an understanding of how they themselves arrived at a position where it made sense for them to be the ones teaching other people how to do it. So these were stories that we wanted to hear. We wanted to know how the people, mostly that we looked up to and admired as educators, and in a lot of ways modeled our careers after, how did they get to a point where they identified as critical educators? So we put out calls, we contacted people directly, and the description of what we wanted from them in terms of their writing is in the lower right-hand corner in italics here. We asked them to compose a narrative that stories an event or experience in your life that contributed to your identification as a critical educator. So that's a challenging task, I think, to begin with, to look back over a life and pick an event. And to do it in 4,000 words, which is pretty tight. And then we asked them to reflect on the event through a critical theoretical lens. So to go a step beyond autobiographical or memoir writing, but to, for lack of a better term, put a scholarly spin on it, to situate their experiences in the critical theories that shape their work. And then to ultimately to describe a teaching practice informed by your experiences. So each of the chapters in the book essentially has three parts. There's a narrative that's in most cases a very personal memoir-ish story about an event or an experience in the author's life. And then the author's kind of stepping back from that and mostly reflecting, some analyzing on, through the lenses of particular social critical lenses. And then some really practical examples of how they bring this experience or this framework to life in teacher education classrooms. This turned out to be really difficult work for folks. It's personal and it's very different from the kind of writing that accomplished researchers are accustomed to doing, because we're accustomed to writing outside ourselves. We're accustomed to telling about what we see other people do and how we make sense of it. But what we got was, I think, was really, it ended up being, I don't want to overuse the word personal, but it's a deeply personal experience, and it was really important for all of us to have worked together and to have senior accomplished scholars say things to us like, this was the most difficult thing I've ever written for publication. I think speaks to both the challenge and maybe even the importance of this kind of work going forward, that we tend to skim over maybe in our lives. I won't say too much else about the content of the book, other than that there are stories that include living in Brazilian military dictatorships and growing up in apartheid South Africa, and major American cities and tiny US farm towns. So the diversity of how this group of people who collectively identifies as critical educators, and Admittedly, it's mostly literacy folks because that's who we know, but there are some social studies educators and math educators included as well. So full disclosure, when we started writing the book, we were, like I said, we were sort of infatuated and compelled by this idea of narrative and autobiography. The word autoethnography doesn't appear in the book anywhere. It happens that one of the contributors, whose name is Sherrick Hughes, was a colleague of Julie's when she was at the University of North Carolina. And we invited him to contribute a chapter. We got into the process and he said, "You guys know what you're doing is autoethnography." And we said, "No, we didn't know that." Well, it turns out that Sherrick was in the process of literally writing the book on autoethnography. So he helped us understand, and his support obviously went a long way in helping us continue to frame and conceptualize with a little bit more certainty what we were doing. But the experience for several of us of having contributed to this book was compelling enough that we wanted to keep at it. So we dove into the more formal ideas of critical autoethnography. And I know now I'm almost 14 minutes in and now I'm getting ready to define it for you. But it's situated in, it's qualitative research, it's ethnography, that focuses on, or that is a personal cultural analysis. And all of the parts of the word mean exactly what you think they mean. The researcher is the site of the cultural inquiry. So it is an examination of myself as the researcher. Within the context of existing research and social critical theory. So that's one of the things that Sherrick really harps on in person and in his book. He likes to say, we're not sitting around navel gazing, which is his way of saying we're not writing memoirs. We're not just telling stories. We're engaged in serious academic work. In order to do that, to do research, you must ground your research in the extant literature, have theoretical frameworks, speak back to a body of knowledge, but doing so through the perspective of your own experiences as a cultural and social being. So this last quote here, very briefly, autoethnography is ethnographic in its methods, and I'll talk quickly through some of the methods and you'll recognize them as ethnographic. Cultural in its interpretation and autobiographical in its content. So the thing that we end up studying are the stories that we tell about ourselves. So about half of the folks who contributed to the book wanted to continue to engage in this process. So we came across the method or the idea of doing collaborative autoethnography, which involves pooling narratives, which fortunately we already had. We had a book of pooled narratives together. So we organized ourselves around the research question: what characterizes teacher educators' development of a critical consciousness and desire to engage in critical teacher preparation? So one of the things that separates collaborative, well, the thing, I guess, that separates collaborative autoethnography from autoethnography is that we're sort of collectively asking and answering the questions. So we start individually and then we pool our data and analyze it together, much the way you would a more traditional ethnographic study. And we're looking across data ultimately to find ways to conceptualize answers to the research question. I won't spend a lot of time on methods. I'll be happy to come back if you have questions, but I'm relying mostly on the fact on hopefully some of these looking familiar as ethnographic methods. Our data sources, we started with the memoirs that we had already written. We included other documents that were relevant. to our experiences that we had described, which included photographs and personal artifacts. We wrote analytic memos. So we all went back into our own chapters that we had already written and wrote analytic memos, trying to identify themes and topics that were prevalent and important across the stories that we had told. And then we interviewed each other. So all this was done at a distance via video conferencing, trying to think about, why did we tell this story in this way? So again, sort of trying to dig into the cracks of these constructed narratives and to understand more about the consciousness, and in some cases unconsciousness, of how these stories were shaped and were told the way they were. Coding, memos, conferencing, collaboration. Again, I'll be happy to come back to this if you really want to hear more about the methods. So what we found, we were able to group into 4 big categories about what were the characteristics of how this group of people who identified themselves as critical educators got to be that way. One element that was really prominent and prevalent across the stories was time. And we conceptualized time as both mediator, and we had to think about it as being mediated as well. So time as mediator, none of us had what we would call like a white light experience. No one woke up suddenly and realized that they were a critical educator. In all of our stories, it was many, many years of building experiences that that got folks to the point where they were when they were writing these stories, which I think sort of makes me kind of thinking about teacher education, makes me think about the way we do things in teacher education and the experiences we create for our students. Certainly not that they're that they certainly are always worthwhile, but the degree to which we're doing more than sort of seed planting, I think comes into question. Time as mediated, this is a very narrative idea, and just thinking about the ways that folks told their stories, and the challenge of telling a story about your past and sort of simultaneously having to recall how you felt and what you thought in the past, and hold that together with how you think now about how you thought then, and to represent that rhetorically in writing presents some challenges, and really brings the idea of the cognitive achievement of storying the self to light. Affect. This is a highly emotional project that involved for all of us to some degree or another vulnerability, anger, complicity, care, love, hope, and compassion. Vulnerability being the most, and we probably all have had, even in our our lives when we're not studying ourselves, moments when thinking about memories, and we get to that moment when we just tell ourselves, nope, I don't want to think about that anymore. The I'm not going there sensation. But autoethnography compels us to go there and to be vulnerable both to ourselves and ultimately publicly. Knowledge building, the idea of intentionally building knowledge and growing ourselves down the path of critical theory and critical thought and critical pedagogy. One of the things that stood out to us was that for many of us, graduate school was a really important kind of fulcrum point, which I think is kind of interesting to think about, especially in relation to time. Many of us are in our late 20s, early 30s, or later, and just now getting access to the kinds of thinking, the kinds of writing, the kinds of practices that really solidified for us the notion of what behaving critically is. There was a lot of use of language like, well, I did this thing in my classroom, but I didn't know what to call it. I didn't have the language for it. So that's where a lot of the work in graduate school came in, where we start getting kind of linguistic handles around things and ways to conceptualize and frame the nature of this work. And then finally, a big part of it was the generative relationships that that sustained and compelled us to do this work, because it's emotional, because it takes time, because it's difficult. Experiences with other human beings, either farther along or traveling contemporaneously the road with us, were really important. Among other things, the relationships that we built provide access to counter narratives, different ways of storying experiences in our lives, building alliances, and helping each of us recognize, anywhere along a range from the existence of inequitable power structures and institutions in our society to our own complicity and participation in those structures. So all of these things were findings that came out of our return to our narratives and engaging in a sort of a more formalized autoethnographic examination of them. So I'll pause just for a moment if anybody has any questions about the study part. Shockingly, this is taking longer than it did in rehearsal, but I'll get through the pedagogical parts and efficiently. Any questions in the chat or anything, Lindsay? No? Okay. All right. I wanted to, Julie and I both really specifically wanted to start incorporating what we had learned into our teacher education practices. For among other reasons, I understand learning, and particularly teachers learning, to be as much about identity construction as knowledge constructions and practical performances. And this was all about that. So you can see on this slide what I've called my conceptual framework for teacher education pedagogy. It is the findings. That was where I started the first time I brought this into teacher education. It's the findings from the collaborative autoethnography that we did. I taught this class several years ago and was kind of had to recreate this slide from memory. It's a lot of text, but I'll try to talk through in a way that makes sense what we did. The goal of a project in one of my English education courses was to put students in a position to study themselves as the blank sociocultural identity, as a white female, as someone who identifies as transgender, as a white male, etc. As that sociocultural marker who is going to be a teacher of adolescence, and to ask ourselves why these things matter, which is different than writing about myself as a white male. So I can write about myself or talk about myself as a white male for, ad infinitum. That's very different than me stopping to ask myself, why does that matter? And what does that mean for me as a teacher? And that's what we were trying to get at with this project. So it started with the tools that I had, with asking them to write narratives, which is a really common practice in teacher education, particularly in literacy teacher education, that had something to do with themselves, focused on one or the intersection of several sociocultural aspects of their identities. And then based on what they wrote about, what we grouped up. So people who are interested in the same things join small groups together. And so going, again, always focusing on not just the navel gazing, but situating our work in broader scholarship. So based on what they were interested in, I provided them readings, differentiated by group, whether they were reading about gender or race or socioeconomics. and they also read a YA novel related to their topic. So they had as their collaborative group, and most of the groups were 3 to 5 students. They treated each of these things, their narratives, the scholarly readings that I provided, and the YA novels and their interviews of each other as data to answer their questions about what does it mean to be blank as a person and a prospective teacher of adolescents. So they worked through this, and it was an extended project, probably half the semester, during which they worked to reach consensus and findings that speak to what they learned about how being a certain kind of person operates as a social and cultural mechanism that influences how they understand themselves as teachers and community members. So I tried to bring together, at least in small group form, this idea of generative relationships among people who were, for example, at least interested in thinking about being a white female prospective English teacher, but just by the nature of being human had very different experiences and understandings of what that meant. So bringing together their stories and learning from their stories collaboratively was the crux of that project. So that's what I've done. That's part of what I've done with pre-service undergraduate teacher ed students. I taught a course a couple years ago called Narrative, Identity, and Inquiry, where we did a little bit more formalized autoethnographic individual work with graduate students who were practicing high school English teachers. Their projects started again with, as a graduate course, we started with some readings around narrative and narrative ways of knowing. Then they wrote personal narratives. We spent some more detailed time reading other autoethnographies and using them as mentor texts to help students understand and get a grasp of sort of some of the genre features. And then they, from the narratives that they wrote, they selected an identity that they wanted to continue to study. I'm aware of the time. I'll start to wrap it up here in just a moment. So for this class, by this time, Sherrick and his partner, Julie Pennington, had published their methods book on how to do autoethnography. So to this point, I was confident that what we were doing was autoethnographic, and we did a lot of reading of autoethnographies and some other folks' conceptualizations of how it should work as a method. But in this class, we used Sherrick's book, Sherrick and Julie's book, pretty step-by-step wise. And one of the aspects of generating data that they focus on and think about is they talk about internal data sources and external data sources. And some of the students in this class, the internal data source, this is the part they referred to as the hippy dippy stuff of thought I could get through the whole presentation saying it, but I can't. Autoethnography. So the way that critical auto interviewing works is it's very much like sitting quietly in a quiet space, closing your eyes and calling to mind memories that are relevant to the story that you're trying to tell and the questions you're trying to answer about yourself. This is one of the most difficult parts because this is where it's difficult because this is the easiest part to stop and say, I don't want to go there. I don't want to think about that memory. I don't want to think about that experience and what it means. But when done well and when done conscientiously and correctly, it's intended and described as a complete sensory experience that is then transcribed. So it's literally for however long you can sit quietly and close your eyes and call memories, and then writing them down as fast as you can and trying to capture the sensory information that has come to you in that memory. And that becomes one of the internal data sources. This is an example of, it's a little polished up, but this is an example of internal data that I wanted to share with you from a male student in the class, a white male student, who was writing about his white maleness. And he writes, "The white police officer came to the window and said, 'Have you been smoking weed?' Don't answer, I can smell it. My mind raced to the roach in my car's ashtray. I'll tell you what," the officer continued, "if there's only a small amount, I'll let you off with a warning." "There's a roach in the ashtray," I said, and then I handed the officer the ashtray from my car. "If this is all there is, I'll let you go." My friends and I, all white, were lined up against the wall of the subdivision. One officer had us empty our pockets while the first officer searched the car. Nothing to be found. Luckily, there was nothing to be found. However, the point of the story is not about luck. The point of the story is that I handed evidence of a crime to a police officer and I was let off without a warning. Now, this is probably a story that he's told hundreds of times. It's a story, and there's currency in stories for a lot of reasons. By his description and admission, this is never a story that he thought about in a way that helped him understand why it mattered. So if you can imagine coupling this story and this experience with some readings and some study of critical race theory and critical whiteness studies, this becomes a really powerful learning experience for a white male teacher, understanding historically and institutionally some of the ways that it matters. We use external data sources as well. A lot of it is interviewing, oftentimes interviewing people who shared the experience. Not necessarily in a way that we would qualitatively otherwise to get a diversity of perspectives, but so we get a diversity of perspectives, but then what we do with them is run our own perspective through them and understand how our versions of truth got to be the way they are. So I'm not so much asking myself, how is my version of this story different than the way my mother remembers it? It's, why is my version of this story different than the way my mother remembers it? This is an example of external interview data that one of my students did with her mother. And according to her, this was never a conversation that she had had previously in her life. She was in her early 40s. This was all brand new information to her. And her mother's talking about how they decided that she should go to a private school. In the 70s, things were just different. Life in a little town seemed to work seamlessly between the blacks and the whites. When we would go shopping, I will never forget how the black kids would be so fascinated by you, your blonde hair and your blue eyes. They couldn't help but touch your hair. It was harmless and you didn't mind. You never met a stranger. There were no issues except when it came to the schools. The education just wasn't good. We had talked to some friends of ours who sent their kids to elementary schools there. They complained about their kids talking black, and their language was different then. It was much more difficult to understand them. Their way of speaking today has definitely improved. So again, kind of thinking about coupling this new information that she's getting with, for example, some literature on racial identity development, and having the opportunity to think back on her youthful experiences and getting new information about how her parents framed their family's existence socially and culturally, and thinking about how and why that matters to her, I think is a potentially really powerful experience. One of the most important steps of analyzing the data that we generate from autoethnography is that we once again turn a critical lens to ourselves and ask ourselves, how and why anyone in our tellings is privileged, particularly if it's us, how and why anyone is penalized, particularly if we are able to recognize our complicity and participation in oppressive structures and institutions. And again, of course, how my autoethnography links to specific research traditions, methods, and associations. And I will, oops, sorry. I will go ahead and stop there because I ran long. And thank you all for your attention. I'm happy to answer any questions or engage any discussions. I think, I didn't see who else in here. I think we may have some autoethnographers in the audience. I'm working with a doc student now who is using autoethnography for her dissertation. Not that she selected and chose autoethnography before I got involved, and she kind of sought me out because of my previous work with it.
Blake,
Yes.
Sherry, if we wanted to learn more about this methodology, what would you, and I'm a beginner, okay, so what would be a good thing to cut one's teeth on?
I guess I'll keep sharing. I think Sherrick's book is Sherrick and Julie Pennington's book is very accessible. The one that I've used. My students, who are also, of course, coming to this really cold and brand new, found it useful. It's a nice combination of their kind of highly theoretical conceptualization of what it means to be and do autoethnography, and here are the steps. This is what you do. So it's quite practical as well. When I was starting out, like I said before I had a good methods textbook, I read a lot of autoethnographies, and if any of you are in the habit of reading autoethnographies, you probably recognize that they often look very different. There isn't, so to read 5 of them and say, okay, now I know how to do it, may be challenging because they may appear to be really different things. But I'd start with a book like Sherrick's.
Thank you, appreciate it.
And there's in the both literacy literature as well as teacher education literature, we're starting to see more folks doing this work. It is often taken up by scholars of color as a methodology of counter narrative, which I think is really interesting and exciting. Very broadly, and probably maybe dangerously broad strokes, when white scholars engage in autoethnography, they tend towards ending up as stories of complicity and awakening. And when scholars of color engage in them, they trend towards being counter-narrative.
Blake, it looks like Christy has her hand up. Christy, do you have a question?
Yeah, I was just curious, are there any resources that have examples of how this might be woven into courses for pre-service teachers that may have like a more of a content focus? If that makes sense.
Being like a course for math ed students?
For example, math and or science ed, like if you wanted, like, I'm just wondering if there are models that could say like, how could you, are there models for how you could weave this theme into a course that is accountable for other things in its learning objectives and syllabus, like as an orientation, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. And Yeah, notice I didn't even show you a picture of the book. I didn't want this to be an advertisement for the book. There's a chapter. So Sherrick is a literacy educator. The chapter that he wrote for our book, he wrote with a math educator, doc student of his. And her chapter is about thinking about the how and why race matters in math education. So, so that's the, because of the nature of what I tend to read, it's mostly literacy stuff, Christy. When I see people doing the work that I think that you're describing, though, it's taking a specific idea, a mathematical concept or process, and asking about my experiences with it, and how and why I've had, for example, roughly positive experiences learning this thing, or negative experiences learning this thing. I did with in my literature ed course this semester, we talked about, my students wrote, what did I call it? Racial literature memoirs, I think is what I called it. But they had to think about a particular experience that they had in a literature class. So content, a book or a piece of literature that they read, and sort of unpack the experience they had through the lens of race. Why, how does me being white contribute to the success that I had and the enjoyment that I got from reading Catcher in the Rye, versus how might a person of color, and this is a lot of the ones that my students of color wrote, where I was marginalized and alienated, and felt like I didn't do as well in literature classes because we read The Catcher in the Rye.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Okay. Maybe can I jump in and ask a question?
Yes.
I'll do my best. I have a very bad internet connection, so if I get disconnected, I'll maybe write you or something. But I'm a graduate student in the UK, originally from the US. I actually graduated from Florida State like 25 years ago. But I'm actually doing, for my thesis, I'm doing an autoethnography on education. I've struggled a little bit with this being an old white guy thing in autoethnography, particularly because I've lived outside of the US for 17 years now, and my educational experience has really just been well outside of any of those issues that you might conduct critical research on. And everything I find on autoethnography is more in that vein. And I'm looking for kind of some resources that I haven't been able to find, I guess, or I guess I'm not satisfied with what I have found, just about the relationship between the individual and institutions. If there are any autoethnographies, perhaps a little more philosophical, less critically oriented, just about the effects of institutions and organized education on the individual.
I can't, Brad, I can't name any for you specifically right now. One that's sort of, I don't know if you've come across any of Lamar Johnson's work.
Nope.
He's at Michigan State and has written a couple of autoethnographical pieces that think about his positioning and having been positioned as a Black male student and scholar by the institutions, societal institutions in his life.
Hi, lady. Sorry about that.
I think one for me, and what I think has been helpful to students is once you get to the point where your topic is kind of self and the institution,
right?
Understanding a little more broadly and conceptually what that means and how that's been framed, and then I don't know if you've gotten to the point of actually writing the question you're asking yourself.
Mhm.
And I didn't mention this. I think one of the things that's exceptionally challenging about autoethnography for folks is that it's really key that you ask a question to yourself that you don't already know the answer to, just as we would in any other research. So when you say, I'm interested in the relationship between the self and the institution, there's a step, at least a step, probably a few steps to get to the question that you really want to understand about yourself and your historical relationships with institutions. So it's kind of it's a dive inward and then positioning yourself to comment back to what we think we know about the relationships between people and schools as institutions.
Right.
I talked way around your question. Mostly the answer is no, but check out Lamar Johnson because he does a little bit of what you're thinking about.
I will. Thanks. I appreciate it.
Hi, Dr. Tenore. This is Cece. I have a question.
Hi, Cece.
So if autoethnography is studying yourself, right, in relation to culture, is identity the only thing that you can study when you're doing autoethnography? Is there something else besides identity? Like, does it have to be through the lens of race, gender, SES, or something like that? So is it only identity, or are there other things that you can do with it?
My experiences have been with identity. I think there, and the way that particularly kind of jumping on the Hughes and Pennington bandwagon, they position this as contributions to social critical theory and scholarship. So thinking specifically about the canonical traditions of things that we associate with critical thought. How power is managed and negotiated across media and identities. Do you have an example of something specific that you wonder?
Oh, I was just curious because I'm using it for my dissertation. That's the plan, but naturally I'm using it through the lens of identity. And so when you were talking, you have that slide where you were talking about what you did with your students. And one of the first things was they needed to pick the identity they were going to study, whether it was race, gender, SES. And so then it made me think about, is there another way? I mean, that's why it was a natural draw for me, because I am studying identity, but I just didn't know if there was another use for it outside.
I had a student last year who wrote a paper that was focused on achievement. So she had been, like many of our students had been throughout her life, a very high achieving student in school. Right. However we define that, whatever that means. So that was sort of that was the concept that she dove into. Okay. And she got into a little bit of, mostly because I was pushing the relationship between her being a white female and her achievement. Right. But she really wanted to understand the way that achievement is designed and framed in schools and how she had negotiated that very successfully. So that maybe is one example of, I think it's all related, but
yes, I think it probably still comes back to identity. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
I think I saw Lama's hand was up. Is Lama still here?
Yes, I'm here. Hi, Blake. Thank you for your presentation, and it's quite insightful and eye-opening. So I appreciate you sharing with us your learning about in this area. And I was wondering about the use of critical autoethnography as a teacher educator, in particular with your work with your pre-service teachers. So you talked I think in the last slide about two considerations that are important to keep in mind: this notion of who is privileged and who is penalized in this work, in storying, and doing this work. And I was wondering in particular about your role as a teacher educator. So let's say your students are engaged in this work and you notice things that could be perhaps like, how do you privilege your own voice in providing feedback around someone else's stories and sense making when you see, for example, oh, in that work, my pre-service teacher may be privileging more themselves, but perhaps penalizing along the way someone else. And perhaps from your lens, they might not be engaging in the critical work that you hope they may be, you know? So how do you problematize that at the same time acknowledging that this is their story, their own sense making? Where do you see your role? What's the threshold there? Does that make sense?
It does. And I think it's my internet connection, probably not yours. And it broke up a little bit, but I think I get the gist. I arrange my answers here. So one is I lean heavily on other people's writing. So I have kind of a good set of critical writings about race and critical writings about gender that that students know are going to be coming at them anyway. That's part of the plan from the beginning.
Mm.
So one answer is that I sort of avoid it and make somebody else do it. Well, I make an author who is more accomplished and effective and efficient than I am about talking about why race matters. And then, so students will read that piece and then we'll confer about that. And often, not always, but often that shakes something loose in them where they say, oh, I see now that I didn't acknowledge the fact that, you know, me being female in this space was relevant, or white, you know, et cetera. And this part of your question about honoring their telling of their stories, I think that gets grounded in kind of a longer term project of sort of reframing what they know about narrative or what they think about narrative, as kind of I referred to this sort of capital T truth. And thinking and reflecting and writing and talking about the idea that just because I say it and it's my story, that one, it's not sacred, and we try to get to a point, the understanding that anything that I say, any part of my life that I put into story is like Bruner describes, a cognitive achievement of me making selections about what to include and what not. And that's usually, I think many of us, just as people, can relate to when we tell stories, you know, we're deciding what to tell and what not to tell. That's I think as universal as an idea as I'm willing to suggest that anything is universal. So kind of working from that and just kind of continuing to push and ask questions. You know, why does your race, your gender, your interest in auto mechanics, whatever, matter in this situation? It's certainly not challenging for them or for me, and it's very intimate. So I would never do a full scale project like this with my first semester students who I just met. I feel like I need to be in relation with them in a really strong way before we start pushing each other into some of these ideas, because I think that's what it takes. They need to know each other, have some trust, and they need to know and have some trust in me.
Thank you.
I have about 1 minute left if there's any final questions for Blake. Ah, the awkward silence. Okay. I don't see any hands raised or any unmuting, no chats. Got the all around claps. Okay, that's good. That's good. Okay, well, thank you all, everyone, for attending this final seminar or colloquium, rather, not seminar. Be on the lookout. We'll be sending out information in January, probably maybe later on this month, depending on how quickly we can get our ducks in a row for next semester's colloquium. So I appreciate everyone that was able to attend. Thank you.
Thank you,
Happy
everyone.
end to the semester. Yeah, thanks, Blake.
Like, if you have a copy of your book around your house, I don't know if you do. I would imagine the FSU Teach people would love to get an electronic version of the chapter you talked about with Sharon and the math educator.
Okay.
Just when you have time, that would be swell.
We'll be happy to.
Thank y'all.